Late summer sunlight lay deep over the red dust road leading into Dust Hollow. Jonas Miller eased the reins, letting his horse drift to a slower pace as he passed the row of sun-stained wooden buildings. All he needed was a cook for a 2-month cattle drive. Someone who could stand wind, grit, bawling calves, and cold dawns. Nothing more. But the first question he asked inside the saloon made the crowded room fall still. "Is Amara Rivers here?" A glass met the table with a sound sharp as a held breath. Card players looked up. The man tending the stove froze mid-motion. The whole place tightened, like he'd asked about a dangerous legend, not a woman. "What do you want with her?" a bearded man asked, voice rough with whiskey. "Looking for a cook. She's too much trouble. She won't work for anybody. Bring her on and you're courting disaster." Their words dropped on the old wooden floor heavier than the heat outside. Jonas wasn't easily warned off. He had lived through winters that took men apart, had curled in frozen trenches for 4 nights of sleet. But the silence that followed her name, that he noted. He thanked them briefly and stepped back into the fine dust drifting on the wind. They might fear her, but instead of slowing his steps, it sparked a stubborn curiosity. The boarding house sat at the end of town, windows open, the scent of fresh baking drifting across the porch. Jonas knocked, and an older woman opened the door, her sharp eyes sweeping him in a single breath. "No rooms left." "I'm looking for Amara Rivers," he said. One slow lift of her brow. "What now?" "No trouble. I want to hire her as a cook." She studied him longer, long enough for him to wonder whether she had misunderstood. At last she let out a low sigh, lifted her apron, and jerked her chin. "In the kitchen. But you're on your own." Jonas followed her through the dining room where a few guests sat eating. The faint clatter of utensils continued, but eyes followed him like he was walking into a place everyone considered dangerous but rarely named. When the owner pushed the kitchen door open, heat surged out first, then the smells, fresh bread, simmering stew, and some spice he couldn't place. But all of it faded when Jonas saw her. Amara Rivers. She stood in the center of the kitchen like someone directing a wild but obedient crew. Her hands moved fast and sure. Sleeves rolled, revealing arms strong and smooth. A curl of dark hair had slipped from her headscarf, catching the glow of the stove. Her face, striking, sharp, alive with purpose. She opened the oven while calling out to someone behind her. The tone brisk but clean, like a newly honed knife. Jonas had never seen anyone like her. She turned just as he stepped forward. They nearly collided. His hand lifted on instinct to steady the pot she carried. His fingers brushed hers. A quick, bright jolt ran through him, gone in an instant, but enough to unsettle his heartbeat. Her gaze met his. Deep, keen, guarded. "If you're here about Mr. Saunders, I'm not apologizing," she said, steady as a challenge. "I'm not here for anyone." "Then what do you need?" "A cook." She hesitated. Then, "Why me?" "Because I hear no one does it better." The corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, more like a reflex she hadn't expected. "I have 3 conditions," she said, as if he'd already agreed. Jonas folded his arms, waiting. 1. I sleep alone. Fair. 2. I bring my own knives. Of course. 3. No one looks down on me. Anyone. Jonas nodded. "I give you my word." Amara studied him, long and exact, like she meant to see what kind of man lived beneath the hat. Then she untied her apron, hung it on the hook, and walked straight to the door. Evening light slid across her as she passed, warming the smooth brown of her skin like faint honey in the sun. She paused at the threshold, glanced back once. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning." "All right." She stepped onto the porch, the breeze lifting the hem of her skirt, and Jonas stood there a moment longer, unsure why his chest had tightened by a beat. He knew only one thing. His life had shifted the moment she looked at him. The next morning, the sun had barely lifted over the ridge when Amara appeared at the gate of the Miller Ranch. A small wagon rolled into the yard, trailing dust and the long silence of 6 cowhands standing in a row as if they'd just seen a storm wearing a skirt. Jonas stepped out just as Amara jumped from the wagon. She brushed the dust from her dress, swept a quick look across the yard like someone surveying a battlefield, then stopped at the kitchen shed by the horse stalls. "This is the kitchen?" she asked, doubtful. Jonas gave a small nod. "It's enough." "Enough for what?" Amara cut in. "This place can't feed one man properly, let alone 6 full-sized cowboys." A small O slipped out of Red, the boldest of the crew, but when Amara turned, he straightened as if answering a drill call. She walked straight inside. Jonas and the 6 followed, but they halted at the doorway, watching her the way folks watch a magician about to perform. Only, the chaos before her was no illusion. A leaking wash basin, sagging shelves, a stove tilting like it meant to fall. Amara set her hands on her hips. "No wonder these men cook so badly." She sniffed, pulled the cloth from her wrist, tied her hair back, and began issuing orders with the speed of a moving front. "You," she pointed at Hank. "Firewood, dry." Hank opened his mouth to ask, but she had already turned to Charlie. "You, clear the table. Left side, not the right. Light's better on the left." Charlie nodded so quickly, his hat nearly slipped. "Red, bring water, clean, not the moldy bucket behind the horse shed." Jonas leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, watching, silent and faintly astonished. In minutes, the crew moved like new students falling in line. And the surprising part, they obeyed. Every one of them, without a word of pushback. Red returned, setting the bucket at her feet, only to bump the table. Water splashed. Amara turned. One look froze him solid. "Sorry, ma'am," Red stammered. "Don't be sorry," Amara said, steady, not sharp. "Do it right." Red bolted out so fast, Jonas had to turn away to keep from laughing. She was good, better than he expected. When the room finally looked less disastrous, Amara paused, watching the sunlight through the small window, as though calculating where to begin the repairs. Jonas stepped in. "Need me for anything?" She glanced up, slightly surprised. "Can you drive a nail straight?" "Worth a try." She handed him a board. When he bent to fix the sagging roof beam, she stood beside him, raising her hand to hold the wood. His hand rose at the same moment. Their fingers touched. Only a flicker, but enough to stop them both, as if the heat paused in the afternoon light. Amara drew her hand back quickly, though not in haste, just a touch unsettled. Jonas went on hammering, but the nail landed a bit off angle, rare for him. She looked over, thinking he hadn't noticed, but Jonas saw it. The glint in her eyes no longer sharp as when she commanded the riders. Softer now, warmer, as if, for this moment, her guard had thinned. By late afternoon, when the sun had paled and the scent of dry grass drifted through the air, Amara stood in the newly arranged kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron, surveying the place again, neater, clearer, set right. Jonas entered carrying a crate of firewood. Neither spoke, but the way he set it down, the way his shoulders eased as he looked around, held a quiet respect she wasn't used to receiving. She watched him, slow and thoughtful. Somewhere between morning and now, her wariness had loosened, and somehow the way he stood there made her feel steady. Jonas reached for the coat hanging by the door, brushed the dust from it instead of tossing it aside like the others would. A small thing, but enough to bring a faint half-smile to her lips, one few ever saw. As the kitchen sank into the last light, they cleared the final scraps from the wooden table side by side. They didn't speak, but in that silence, something new took shape. Warm, low, hard to name. For the first time in years, Amara realized she didn't feel alone, and that was the part that unsettled her most. They left the ranch at dawn. The sky washed clear after the night wind. 7 riders, a herd of more than 100 cattle, and Amara's cook wagon rolled out of the valley. The wheels creaked in a steady rhythm, leaving behind fresh grass still wet with dew. Amara sat firm at the wagon's front, her headscarf keeping her hair in place though a few curls slipped free, catching the early light. Jonas rode to the left of the herd, keeping what he hoped was a casual distance, yet he couldn't stop glancing her way every few minutes. Not out of worry, not out of doubt, but because. When Amara leaned to keep balance, the light traced her cheekbone in a way that drew his eyes without asking permission. Amara knew he kept looking, but she pretended not to. Partly to keep her focus, partly because she didn't yet understand the odd pressure in her chest every time their eyes met by chance. They rode in silence the whole morning. The cowhands, usually loud, were quieter than usual. Some feared her scolding. Most simply wanted to carry out their tasks right so she wouldn't correct them. At noon, they stopped near a small creek. Amara served each man a hot meal, pointed out where to set the field stove, corrected Hank's way of chopping onions, taught Charlie a trick to keep the fire steady in strong wind. For the first time in months, the crew felt they had someone they could rely on. "She's a miracle," Charlie whispered to Jonas as he took his bowl. Jonas only answered with a low "yeah," but his eyes betrayed more. By late afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying dust from the far ridge. They stopped at a small rest post. A short, stout trader salting meat stepped close when he saw Jonas, his voice dropping as if afraid to be overheard. "You headed through Grant Hale's stretch?" Jonas frowned. "We're staying on the main trail." "What main?" "He runs everything now. Heard the young men up the mountains have to pay just to cross." Jonas narrowed his eyes. "What kind of man is he?" "The kind you don't want on your heels. Used to trade cattle. Now he squeezes folks dry. You're moving a herd. He'll find a way to bother you." Jonas looked toward Amara. She was tightening the wagon's ropes, hair lifted by the wind, her face steady and calm in a way he rarely saw. She didn't need this news. Not now. Not when she was fighting to prove herself to men who thought women belonged in shadows behind a stove. "Keep it between us," Jonas told the trader. "Remember, Grant Hale doesn't skip a target." Jonas nodded, though his eyes stayed on Amara, watching her wipe dust from a large pot with a motion both firm and quietly graceful. Evening came. The first night on the trail was always uneasy. New cattle, strange noises, too much wind in the grass. They camped on a low rise, circled the fire, metal utensils clinking softly under the humming dark. Jonas took the first watch, walking the perimeter, listening to every shift in the herd. When he returned to the fire, he stopped short. Amara sat there. She held her hands near the flames, the light painting a warm glow over her dark skin. Her hair was swept back by the wind, a few curls resting against her cheek. She didn't see him. She simply stared at the fire, lost in thought. A rare stillness. A beauty with no effort at all. A pull that made Jonas breathe slower. He stepped closer. Amara looked up. Firelight reflected in her eyes. Deep, clear, carrying a language he didn't dare interpret. "Cold?" he asked, his voice lowered without thinking. "Not cold," she said, though her hands stayed near the heat. "Just too used to being alone." Jonas sat across from her. Neither spoke. They watched the fire, yet each felt the other's presence with an intensity neither expected. When the flames dropped to embers, Jonas rose to finish his watch. Amara left the fire a few minutes after, heading toward her wagon. But she paused at the door. Jonas stood a few steps away, leaning lightly against his saddle, looking up at a sky full of stars. He turned just as she glanced. Their eyes met, longer than they should have, long enough for Amara's heartbeat to falter. Jonas gave a slight nod, a wordless wish for rest. She stepped into the wagon, though her chest didn't settle as she expected. Outside, Jonas kept his gaze on the sky, though his thoughts lingered on the way she had looked at him. And both knew something had shifted tonight. By late afternoon, the sky shifted faster than any of them expected. Far off, dark clouds gathered like a heavy blanket, dragging across the horizon. Jonas glanced at Amara, ready to warn her, but the wind rose before he could speak. "Storm," he said. Amara looked at the sky, then at the herd, already tightening into uneasy clusters, seeking cover. Wind tore at her headscarf, pulling loose curls against her cheek. "How far to shelter?" she asked, steady. "Half a mile," Jonas said. But the words barely left his mouth before a hard gust slammed into the wagon, lifting one wheel off the ground. Amara pulled the reins to steady it, but the wagon lurched again, harder this time, sudden. "Careful!" Jonas shouted as he saw her lose balance. He drove his horse in, jumped from the saddle in one clean motion. As Amara slipped from her seat, he reached her at the exact moment she fell. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against his chest before she hit the ground. It lasted only seconds, but long enough for her breath to catch. The wind stung their faces. Her hair curled around his arm. She said nothing. Jonas said nothing. Only the storm roared around them, while they stood close enough to hear each other breathe. "Come on," Jonas said, voice lower than usual. "I'll lead. Hold tight." Amara didn't answer, only nodded. But when he set his hand on her shoulder to lift her back into the seat, she felt his warmth through the cold wind. They drove the herd toward an abandoned line shack under a low rise. The old wooden structure leaned but held. Jonas led the horses under the broken awning, tied them down, then turned to Amara. "Inside. This one's strong." She went in first. Jonas followed, closing the door. The wind dropped to a dull, hollow roar, like distant surf. In the dim space, he built a small fire with a pile of dry wood in the corner. Flames rose, casting soft light over Amara's face. She sat near it, hands extended, breath still unsteady from the run. Jonas sat across from her, only a few steps away, close enough for her to feel heat from the fire, and from him. The wind howled harder. Rain hammered the roof like thrown gravel. "I didn't think it would hit this fast," Amara said, eyes on the flames. "Prairie weather," Jonas replied. "It can turn in a minute." Amara angled her head toward him. Firelight lingered in her eyes, making them look deeper, warmer. something moving behind them she hadn't yet hidden. "Can I ask something?" she said quietly. Jonas nodded. "Go ahead." "Why choose me?" "You don't know who I am. You heard what people say. You heard enough." Jonas held her gaze. No hesitation, no shift. "Because you're not like anyone I've met." The wind pushed against the shack, but inside, Amara felt the real storm move in her chest. The words, plain, sure, honest, hit her sharper than she expected. She turned away, though Jonas saw her mouth tremble, as if holding on to an old, familiar shield. For a while, the shack held only wind, the crackle of burning wood, and the sound of two steady breaths sharing the same tight space. When the storm eased, Jonas stood and pulled two blankets from a wooden chest, one in the left corner, one in the right. "You take that side," he said. "It's warmer." Amara nodded and moved to her corner. Jonas lay down on the opposite side. Firelight cast their shadows on the wall, two silhouettes 3 steps apart, yet close enough to hear their own heartbeats. "Get some sleep," Jonas said, voice low, softened. Amara closed her eyes, but neither slept until near dawn. Not because of the storm, but because of all the things neither dared to say, growing in the dark between them. The morning after the storm, the prairie lay under a thin veil of mist, as if someone had brushed a calming hand across the earth. Amara stepped out of the line shack first, sunlight laying a warm, honey-gold sheen across her skin. Jonas followed a few paces behind, far enough that she wouldn't notice how much of last night still lived in his eyes. The crew packed up quickly and moved on before noon. No one talked much, but something had shifted between Jonas and Amara, quiet, unspoken, settling between them like a fine thread. When they reached the second way station, the air turned strange at once. The station master stood at the door with a troubled expression, a paper sealed in red in his hand. Jonas dismounted. Amara stood behind him, her wary gaze rising like instinct. "I'm afraid," the man hesitated. "You're barred from the northern trail." Jonas frowned. "Why?" He handed over the notice. Jonas read it fast. It was exactly what he feared. An order from the local trade guild claiming Jonas lacked proper standing. His crew posed a security concern, and most pointedly, they were traveling with a woman of questionable morals. Jonas stopped at that line. Questionable morals? The station master swallowed and cast a quick glance at Amara. "Just relaying it." Grant Hale signed the order. That name hit the ground like a dropped stone. Jonas felt Amara's shoulders stiffen behind him. "What else did he say?" Jonas asked, voice low. The man paused, then sighed. "Said you stir trouble. And she—" He looked at Amara, then lowered his eyes. "Said she's dangerous, untrustworthy, and no black woman should be traveling among a group of men." For a moment, the world drained of sound. Amara stood still, her face unreadable, but her eyes hollowed like a wind-struck lake. Not from the insult. She had heard worse all her life, but because it landed now, at the exact moment she had begun to feel she belonged. She turned before anyone could see the pain flicker through her. "Amara," Jonas called softly. She didn't stop. Jonas followed. Behind the station, he found her by the wagon wheel, hands gripping the wooden rim, steady, but so tight her knuckles blanched. "Don't believe a word of that," Jonas said quietly. "Which part?" Her voice was sharp, the kind of sharpness people use to keep themselves from breaking. "All of it. Every word he said." Amara exhaled, still turned away. You heard it once. I've heard it my entire life. Jonas moved closer, slow, as if any sudden step might startle her. Amara. She didn't turn. He laid his hand gently over hers, not holding, just touching. A careful touch, weighted with respect. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Jonas spoke so low, the wind seemed to hush to listen. No one defines your honor but you, and I won't let anyone insult you, not even for a breath. Silence stretched. Then Amara turned. For the first time, her eyes held no guard, only a quiet, human exhaustion. You don't have to protect me, she said. No, Jonas answered, straightening, but I want to. There was no smile, no thank you, only a long, steady look between them. Silent, real, softening the air itself, as if the sky bent closer to hear. Back at camp, Jonas handed the decree to the men. Red cursed under his breath. Charlie smacked his hat against his boot. Hank struck the wagon wheel, at a loss for words. We're not leaving anybody behind, Red said. Especially her, Hank added. Amara stood a few paces away, taken aback by their certainty. She had been left behind by crews before, cast aside for being different. But here, no one stepped back. Jonas looked around, voice firm. We change course. East Trail. Longer, but we'll make it. No one argued. They nodded, almost in unison. Amara looked at each of them, quiet, and for the first time in years, something eased inside her. No one left her behind. No one listened to Grant Hale. She said nothing, but Jonas saw from a distance the subtle drop of her shoulders, lighter, more trusting, and perhaps safer. By late afternoon, the ground felt tight beneath the herd. The wind shifted, carrying a strange, scorched smell from the north. Jonas knew that smell. He had breathed it once when a pasture was torched in a cattle dispute years before. This isn't good, Jonas said, tightening the reins. Amara was securing the grain sacks behind the wagon. She looked up. What? Black smoke slid over the tree line like a creature crawling toward them. Hank, push the herd east, Jonas called. Red, Charlie, clear the way. The crew sprang into motion, but the prairie wind was too strong. Within minutes, the sky ahead turned the color of ash. Dust, dry grass, and embers whipped through the air. The fire spread with a speed that didn't feel natural, more like someone had given it direction. Jonas didn't need to hear a name to know the message. Grant Hale. Hot wind slammed against Amara's face. Smoke stung her eyes, tearing a cough from her chest that tightened her ribs. But she held the mule's reins, trying to steady the wagon. A spinning gust hit. The wagon lurched hard. Amara staggered, slipping off balance, nearly falling from the driver's seat. Amara! Jonas shouted. He drove his horse forward, leapt from the saddle before it stopped, and caught her just as she pitched toward the wheel. His arms closed around her, pulling her fully into him, light in his hold, as if she no longer had the breath to stand. Smoke cut her lungs again. Another cough shook her. Jonas gripped her tighter, his hand firm at her back, keeping her upright. Come with me. Now, he said, his voice low, urgent. They drove the herd toward a small lake. The ground there, trampled by past drives, held little dry grass to burn. When they broke free of the thick smoke, Jonas turned to her, her face pale, lips trembling faintly, one eye squeezed shut against the sting. You all right? He asked. She tried to nod, but the cough rose again. Jonas set a hand on her shoulder, concern plain. "There's an old cabin nearby," he said. "Rest first." She didn't argue. They left the herd with Hank and Red, and Jonas guided her toward a weathered cabin under a line of willows. Dusk settled in, the glow of the distant fire casting the whole sky in a strange red, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, Jonas shut the door to block the smoke. He started a fire with the dry wood stacked in the corner. Amara sat beside it, her hands trembling from cold and the smoke still lodged in her chest. When she covered her mouth to cough again, Jonas moved closer at once. "Slow breaths," he said, his hand steady on her shoulder. Amara tried, but her breath broke. Jonas lifted her hand away, set his palm against her back, steadying her as if lending her his own rhythm. "Look at me," he said quietly. She lifted her eyes. In the flicker of the flames, Jonas's face blurred and sharpened by turns, dust in his hair, smoke on his clothes, but his eyes, deep, intent, fixed on her with a focus that steadied her breath one small piece at a time. They sat close enough that his breath brushed her cheek, close enough to hear the slow certainty of his heartbeat, close enough that no words were needed. The cabin held its silence, only the wind outside, only the warmth shared between them. Amara whispered, breath still thin, "I thought I was going to fall." Jonas didn't look away. "I won't let you fall." Neither moved first. Neither leaned in. The distance simply vanished between them. Jonas's fingers touched the back of her hand. She turned her hand over and let it rest in his. A quiet hold. No demand. No haste. Only truth. Nothing bold in the dark cabin. Only two people finding warmth after too much wind and fire. Jonas pulled a thin blanket closer. Amara lowered her head to his shoulder, slowly, as though testing if the place was safe. Jonas shifted to meet her, no words needed. That slow lean, that quiet breath, that seeking hand, was all the closeness they needed. No rush, no hunger. Just two wounded hearts finding each other on a night when the world outside burned. That night, they gave each other the one thing neither had been touched by in years. Trust. And both knew. After tonight, there was no turning back for either heart. The morning after the burning sky, the cabin by the lake lay wrapped in pale mist, as if nature itself tried to cover whatever had passed in the dark. Amara woke first. Thin light slipped through the boards, brushing over Jonas's arm resting loosely on the blanket beside her. The moment, warm, quiet, too close, startled her like something she had no right to allow. She sat up slowly, easing her hand free, careful not to stir anything that belonged to the night before. Jonas shifted but didn't wake. His face, in stillness, looked different, softer, less guarded. Amara pulled her scarf tight around her shoulders and stepped outside before he opened his eyes. She needed the air, needed the distance, needed something to remind her she didn't belong to anyone. When Jonas woke, she was already at the lake's edge, a lone figure in the silver light. They set out early. The morning wind was clear, the sky cleaner, but neither spoke of the night behind them. Jonas glanced at her now and then, but unlike before, she avoided his eyes, watching the trail, the herd, the reins in her hands. Not cold, just avoiding. Jonas felt it plainly, though he didn't know how to pull the distance back, or more truthfully, back to where it had been last night. The words rising in him stuck in his throat, and Amara built her walls so fast she surprised herself. Near noon, they stopped. Amara opened the supply chest and froze. The rice sacks had been slit, flour mixed with dirt, grease spilled down the boards, fruit crushed in the corner of the wagon. She stood still, breath slipping a beat. Jonas came behind her, saw it, and tightened his grip on the saddle straps. "Grant Hale," Jonas said under his breath. "It has to be him." Amara knelt to gather what she could. Her fingers trembled, though her movements stayed controlled. "We'll manage," Jonas said, stepping closer. "I'll find more. The others will help." But Amara stepped back. Not far. Just enough for him to feel the invisible wall. "Last night was circumstance," she said quietly. "You don't have to worry too much." Jonas swallowed the words he wanted to say. It wasn't circumstance. He only let out a slow breath and answered softly, "I'm not worried because of last night. I'm worried because of you." Amara didn't answer, didn't risk meeting his eyes. That afternoon, they stopped at a small water post to restock. A few traders stood near the well, talking loudly. One heavy-set white man saw Amara, lifted his chin with a sneer. "Hey, Miller, lost your mind hiring a black woman to feed a crew of men?" Amara stopped. Her shoulders tightened for a heartbeat. Jonas stepped in front of her instantly, his voice so hard the traders fell silent. "You say one more thing, and you'll be apologizing till winter breaks." Jonas didn't raise his voice, but the weight of it made the man step back. It should have ended there. But Amara turned to Jonas, and her eyes weren't warm. "You didn't need to do that," she said softly. "He insulted you," Jonas said. "And you think I can't stand on my own?" It wasn't meant as a cut, but it landed sharp enough to leave him breathless. "Amara, that's not—" "Jonas," she said, the words soft as sand shifting under wind. "Don't protect me as if I'm weak." She walked back to the wagon, leaving Jonas standing alone by the well. His chest tightened like someone had struck him through. By nightfall, the camp was set and the fire low. They ate what Amara could make from the remains, and though the meal was sparse, it was good enough to silence everyone. Jonas sat not far from her, but no words came. Each time their eyes brushed, she looked away at once. Night settled over the camp slowly. The crew drifted to sleep. Jonas stayed by the fire. His hand drifted to his other palm, the place that, days ago, had held Amara's hand inside the cabin. He closed his fingers, as if trying to hold on to a warmth he feared was slipping away. That morning, the crew reached the edge of Maple Crossing only to be stopped. A thick rope stretched across the trail, a wooden sign hanging from it in hard carved letters. "Miller Drive Not Permitted." Jonas dismounted, frowning. A town official stepped out, polished enough not to look like a thug, but speaking with the cold tone of someone waiting for an excuse. "New regulation," he said. "Grant Hale filed a complaint. Claims your drive threatens local trade. Until the matter's resolved, you're not allowed into town." "And we need supplies?" Jonas asked. "Not my concern." Jonas bit back the anger rising in him. This wasn't law. This was pressure, and the hand behind it was obvious. Amara stood one step behind him, her eyes darkening. She knew she was part of why the town watched the crew with wary stares. Grant Hale didn't just want Jonas to fail. He wanted her to feel like a burden. Charlie stepped forward. "We need clean water. Flour. We can't keep—" "Not allowed," the man repeated, then shut the gate. For a moment, the wind felt colder. The crew went silent. Hank kicked at the dirt, muttering. Jonas looked toward the eastern ridge. Longer, rougher, but open. We'll take the mountain pass, Jonas said. Amara looked from him to the winding path cutting around the stone ridge. She knew the truth. The detour was because of her. She pressed her lips together, holding back what she wanted to say. The mountain trail was worse than they expected. The wagon wheels slipped on rock. The cattle bawled from fear. Jonas and Hank pushed from behind, sweat mixing with dust. At a narrow ledge, the wagon nearly slid over a sinkhole. Amara held the mule's reins tight, whispering to keep it calm. "We can't do this forever," Charlie gasped. Jonas scanned the ridge, then looked at Amara. Her gaze drifted toward the town below, far, but within walking distance. "Let me go," she said. "No," Jonas answered too quickly. "Jonas," she said, voice low but firm. "I'll talk to them. No weapons, no threats, just talk. They won't listen. Maybe not. But if I don't try, we stay stuck." Jonas looked at her face, dust on her cheeks, fatigue in her breath, but in her eyes, something unmovable. He wanted to stop her, of course he did, but he knew this. Holding her back out of his fear was something Amara would never accept. "Go with Red," he said. She shook her head. "Two of us look like pressure. Alone looks like a request." Jonas clenched his jaw. There was no better choice. "Go and come straight back," he said quietly, softer than he meant to. Amara nodded, but she didn't look at him, afraid she'd lose her resolve. She walked down the mountain alone. Jonas watched her until she became a small shape on the dusty road. His worry wasn't about her strength. He knew her strength. It was the world that didn't always show mercy to someone like Amara. By late afternoon, she returned. She wasn't bruised. No one had laid a hand on her. But her eyes, darker, rimmed red, holding the weight of words that cut deeper than any blade. Jonas stepped toward her the moment she reached camp. "Amara." "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. The words rose like a shield. Jonas didn't push. He only walked beside her, keeping his steps light, not crowding the space she needed. She moved to the back of an abandoned shed near the water post and sat on the low wooden step. Hands on her knees, back straight, as if holding herself upright was the only way to keep from falling. Jonas stood beside her for a moment, not speaking, not touching, just there. After a while, he sat next to her, still silent, still not looking at her. He simply let his shoulder rest against hers, a small touch, enough to say what he couldn't shape into words. "You're not alone." Amara exhaled, long and deep, as if letting go of something that had sat too heavy in her chest. "I talked to them," she whispered. "They called me things I thought I'd left behind." Jonas didn't answer. He only leaned, letting his shoulder touch hers more clearly, solid, steady, asking nothing in return. Amara turned her face away, but Jonas still saw the red around her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, just loud enough for the wind to hear. The evening breeze tugged softly at her hair, and in that small moment, with no one saying another word, the silence between them became a place to rest. The sun spilled over the prairie like boiling oil. The mountain detour they'd taken stretched twice as long, twice as harsh, and left them with a hard truth. Less water, less food, and barely any sleep. By the fifth day, exhaustion carved itself into every face. Charlie's eyes were bloodshot. Hank had stopped joking. Red drifted like a man sleepwalking. The meals Amara cooked were little more than thin porridge, enough to keep a body moving, not enough to keep spirits up. And Jonas was worse than all of them. He pushed ahead every hour, searching for water, checking the cattle, steadying the crew. Everyone could see the weight on him, responsibility, and the fear of failing the people he meant to protect. On the fifth night, they stopped beneath a slab of bare mountain rock. Jonas tried to stand after handing out the last of the water, but his knees buckled. "Jonas!" Charlie reached for him, but was too late. Jonas fell forward, catching himself with one hand before he hit the ground. Amara, stirring a pot of boiling water, heard and ran. When she saw Jonas slumped, breath broken, something inside her seized tight. She knelt beside him. "Jonas?" Her voice was low, but sharp as a needle. He shut his eyes, trying to speak. "I'm fine." She gripped his shoulder, not gently like before, but firmly enough that he opened his eyes in surprise. "You're not." Her voice trembled, barely. "And you don't have to pretend you're strong in front of me." Jonas tried to answer, but his body shivered again. The lack of sleep, the worry, the endless strain, all of it crashed at once. He pitched forward. Amara caught him without thinking, her arms lifting him as if her body knew what to do before she did. His forehead brushed hers, his breath hot, unsteady. She whispered, quiet, certain, "I won't let you fall." No one heard. No one needed to. It was only the two of them, in the thin firelight, and a promise pulled from the deepest place in her heart. They moved him into a patch of shade. Amara stood, inhaled hard, then turned to face the crew. "Listen to me," she said. Not a command, not a shout, just a steady voice, solid enough to make 6 men who'd survived storms and wild beasts stop what they were doing. "We're low on food and water, but we still have strength, and we still have a path." Hank scratched his head. "Amara, we're worn out. Worn to the bone." "I know," she said, cutting in. "I'm tired too. Jonas is tired. But there's a small settlement northeast of here. Half a day's cross if you know the ridge. I saw the path when I went to negotiate." Red frowned. "Locals use that trail. It's rough." "Tough," Amara said with a nod. "But not impossible. And I'll lead." The men exchanged looks. From where Jonas lay resting, he opened his eyes a little. He saw Amara standing tall, hands braced at her hips, her eyes lit with something he'd never seen before. Not pride, but resolve. She started assigning tasks. "Charlie, build a small fire and boil the rest of the water, half a pot only. Hank, check the cattle, the weakest go last. Red, fix the wagon ties. We'll lighten load for speed." Each line came steady, measured. No one argued. No one hesitated. They followed her as if doing so had always felt right. Jonas watched from afar, his breath slowing, worn but changed. Something eased in his eyes, something like relief, something like trust. When the men dispersed, Amara turned to him. "Rest," she said. "I'll handle it." Jonas tried to smile but was too drained to manage it. He only whispered, "Amara, thank you." She didn't answer. She only looked at him for a long second, soft and strong at once, as if learning how to listen to her own heart. By late afternoon, they started climbing the narrow path along the ridge. Stones rolled beneath their boots. But Amara walked in front, each step sure, her focus so sharp no one doubted her. When they finally descended into the valley on the other side, the crew nearly collapsed from relief. Under the sunlight waited a small cluster of houses, Hallow Ridge. Amara turned back to them. No one spoke. Charlie let out a breath like he'd shed the weight of the sky. Jonas, still weak, pushed himself upright just to see her clearly. His eyes no longer held worry. no longer held only the urge to protect, but respect, deep, certain, and something that tightened his chest. He loved her, and he knew it the moment she led them off the mountain. Amara met his eyes, and in that moment she saw one thing. For the first time in her life, she stood tall, and someone finally saw her worth exactly as it was. Hallow Ridge seemed like a forgotten settlement on the open prairie, but the moment Jonas's crew arrived, Amara felt something was off. People kept their heads down when passing one another. Storefronts cracked open only an inch. Conversations died the second the crew walked by. One evening, when Amara brought medicine to an elderly woman with aching joints, the old woman grabbed her hand, voice trembling like leaves brushed by wind. "Child, don't let them see you helping me. Hale has eyes all over this town." Amara froze. "Watching for what?" she asked. The woman glanced around, then whispered, "He wants the town scared. He wants folks too frightened to fight back when he takes their land." "Land?" Amara leaned forward. "Not cattle?" The woman shook her head. "Cattle's just his excuse. He wants the water rights, the land, the crossings. Anyone who signs over their property gets left alone. Anyone who doesn't, their shop gets wrecked, their goods blocked, or false charges pinned on them." Amara saw the fear in the woman's eyes, fear that had settled deep, pressing the whole town flat. She sat silently for a moment. Then she asked a question that felt like a gust of wind rising inside her chest. "Is there anyone willing to stand against him?" The old woman looked at her, looked long, then gave a small nod. "There is, but they're scared. They only need someone who isn't." Amara returned to camp that night with a clarity Jonas wasn't used to seeing. He waited for her by the oil lamp outside the inn. "Where were you?" he asked, voice slow but weighted with concern. "Listening," she said. "To what?" "To the truth about Hale." She told him everything, not as accusation, but as a final piece of a puzzle falling into place. Hale didn't want cattle. He wanted land, water, control. He ruled the town through fear, not power. When she finished, Jonas didn't answer at once. He watched her, then nodded. "What do we do?" "Not what do you do, but we." Amara heard it clearly. Something she once avoided, now a quiet place to lean. "We find the people who want to resist," she said. "I'll talk. You stand behind me." Jonas smiled slightly. "I'm always behind you." The next day, Amara went door to door. No hard knocking, no big speeches. Only soft taps, a steady smile, and one question. "Are you tired of living under Hale's control?" Some closed their doors, some hesitated. But then slowly, doors opened fully. A small merchant whispered, "He forced me to sign over my land." A mother said, "My boy was beaten for not paying his extra tax." A thin blacksmith muttered, "If someone leads, I'll follow." One by one they gathered. Not many, but enough to light a spark. That night, in the dim light of the barn, Amara stood before them, oil lamps throwing warm glow across her face. "Hale survives on your fear," she said. "If we take real evidence to the regional council, witnesses, statements, proof, he'll have nothing left to hold on to." Jonas stood behind her, silent, eyes following her every move, equal parts trust and pride. "We go together," Amara finished. "No one left behind, no one harmed, no one forced to tremble anymore." A voice from the back called, "Yes!" Then another, and another. People who once kept their heads low now lifted them. The hearing took place in a small hall, old beams, rows of wooden benches. Hale entered confident, as if he owned the room, but this time he faced not Jonas alone, but a whole town standing behind Amara Rivers. The council read the accusations: land coercion, illegal taxing, controlling water lines, fabricated charges. Hale scoffed. No one can prove it. A woman's voice cut through the room. We can. Amara stepped forward. She placed on the table a bundle of anonymous letters the townsfolk had received. Threats, forced agreements, supply cutoffs. She presented merchants' statements. Maps of water routes seized by Hale. Each piece hit the table like a nail through Hale's arrogance. When the council asked for witnesses, almost 20 people rose. No one shook. No one hid. They stood as if Amara's breath held them upright. Hale looked around, and for the first time realized he wasn't losing to law. He was losing to a town that no longer feared him. The council rose and declared, Grant Hale is to leave this region. All land returns to its rightful owners. A collective breath broke across the hall. Jonas turned to Amara, his eyes holding something deeper than gratitude or admiration. Recognition, respect, and love. Quiet, undeniable. And Amara, with the last gold light falling across her face, saw one truth. Hale wasn't defeated by force. He was defeated by a community that a single woman had reminded of its own strength. By the time the crew returned to Dust Hollow, dusk had washed the land in a worn, weary light, carrying a quiet relief underneath. The familiar corrals rose behind the line of ferns, fence rails marked by weather, and the lean-to kitchen where Amara had first frowned. Everything looked unchanged, yet neither she nor Jonas were the people who had left this place. Jonas dismounted first. He turned to offer her a hand, but Amara stepped down light as a bird and avoided his touch by a single breath. Not full avoidance, just a small guard around her heart. Jonas looked at the hand she didn't take, held it there for a moment, then slipped it into his pocket. A small gesture, but enough to weigh the evening down. Inside the kitchen, they prepared their first meal after the long drive. Amara chopped vegetables. Jonas lit the fire. They spoke little, but every moment they stood close tightened the air, like the stillness before a storm. Once Jonas reached behind her to take a pot from the shelf. He stood so near that his warmth brushed the back of her neck. Amara's body stiffened a little, but she didn't move. She drew in one slow breath, trying not to let that brief touch send her heart racing. Sorry, Jonas murmured, stepping back, voice low. It's fine, Amara said, eyes on the cutting board. Your ranch, your kitchen. No, Jonas said quietly. Your kitchen. Her hand paused. She didn't answer, but her lashes trembled, like wind touching a wire drawn too thin. During dinner, they sat at a distance both felt too wide. The men laughed, retelling the journey and the victory over Hale. Jonas mostly stared at his spoon. Amara kept her expression calm. Afterward, everyone headed to bed early. Only Amara stayed behind, washing dishes under the dim yellow lamp. Jonas leaned in the doorway, watching her for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Amara. She kept washing as if she hadn't heard, but he knew she had. He walked toward her, slow, steady, respectful of the space she guarded. There's something I've wanted to say since we left Hallow Ridge. Amara set the bowl down. Her hands were still wet, but her gaze stayed fixed on the table instead of him. Jonas moved beside her, close enough that his breath brushed the curve behind her ear. She shivered. "Let me," Jonas said, reaching to fix the loose tie in her hair. He did it gently, unhurried, his fingers passing close to her neck. A thin current ran down her spine. Amara turned, less out of startle, more out of not knowing how to stand still in that moment. They were closer in this kitchen than they had ever been. The room was quiet. The night quiet. Only the sound of their hearts rose above the crackle of the fire. Amara whispered, voice unsteady. "I've never been chosen." Jonas's expression softened like silk in lamplight. "Amara, I've only known how to save myself," she went on. "Never leaned on anyone. Never trusted anyone enough. I don't know if I have enough to stay in someone's life." Jonas took half a step forward, closing the distance to a thin, breath-tight line. "I choose you," he said, low and steady. "Every day. Not once. Not because of that night. But because you're the one person I trust to stand beside me." Amara bit her lower lip, as if her heart were fighting itself. "Jonas," she whispered, wind soft. He waited for more. Waited for agreement. Waited for her to close the remaining space. But a wounded heart rarely chooses without trembling. Old fear rose fast, pulling her back toward the safety she knew too well. She stepped away. "I need to finish the kitchen," she said, avoiding his eyes. Then she turned and walked quickly out of the room, leaving Jonas alone in the dim light. Jonas stared at the door she'd disappeared through. The fire's glow reflected in his eyes, sad but steady. He understood one thing clearly. She wasn't running from him. She was running from her own fear, and he was willing to wait, as long as it took. That morning, the sky over Dust Hollow was so clear it felt washed clean after a string of dust-storm days. Wind moved along the fence line, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and the familiar sounds of the ranch. The cattle, Hank's hammer tapping in steady rhythm, Red humming off-key near the barn. But one corner of the ranch was different now. One Jonas had spent days repairing with his scarred hands. The lean-to kitchen where Amara once frowned at its makeshift state no longer looked the same. Jonas had replaced the stove, added a stronger roof, rebuilt the racks, and set new shelves straight and square. The dirt floor was paved with flat stones. The wall had been reinforced. Morning light slipped through a narrow vent, laying a warm stripe of brightness across the new wooden table. And in the center of that table, Jonas placed a small gift, a cream kitchen cloth, the stitching done with care. Only one letter on it, A. No ornaments, no flourish. Just one letter. Yet it carried everything he wanted to say. Jonas stood behind the half-open door, unsure if he hoped more, or feared more. Part of him worried she'd see the cloth and walk away. But a larger part of him only wished she'd understand. This kitchen, this roof, this life, he wanted to share it with her. Footsteps softened outside. Amara appeared in the doorway. She stopped right there. Her gaze swept the new kitchen, every corner, every detail, the order, the care, the things she had once had to fight for, now laid before her as if someone understood her breath for breath. Then her eyes found the cloth. A quiet pause settled. Not heavy, just the stillness of someone finding what they never believed they deserved. "Jonas." Her voice had softened with the room. I wanted you to have a place that's truly yours," Jonas said, stepping out from where he'd been standing, voice low but steady. Not because you cook for us, not because you're stronger than the six of us together, but because this is where I see you, for the long haul. Amara turned to him. No avoiding, no retreat, no running. Jonas drew a breath and finally asked the question he'd carried since the mountain pass. Do you want to stay as my person? A simple question, but the truest confession he had ever spoken. Amara didn't answer at once. She stepped toward the table, touched the stitched cloth. The plain threads warmed her palm. Then she faced Jonas. The space between them closed to half a breath. Jonas, she said softly, her eyes deep and bright as morning. I came here looking for work. Somewhere temporary. Somewhere no one would bother me. She placed her hand on the front of his shirt, her first time reaching for him on her own. Her fingers pressed lightly into the fabric, as if testing whether this moment was real. But what I found, her voice tightened, warm with emotion rising inside her, was a home. Jonas couldn't hide the smile that formed, small, quiet, enough to warm his whole face. He held out his hand. Amara set her hand in his without hesitation. They stepped out into the yard as the sun dipped behind the far ridge. Sunset washed Amara's face in soft gold, catching in her curls like strands of copper. Jonas held her hand, not tight, just sure. A hold that said he had no intention of letting go. Evening wind moved around them, light as a blessing from the open prairie. Amara looked toward the cattle in the fading light, then at the cabin where yellow lamplight had just begun to glow. The piece of it was so complete she had to close her eyes a moment to believe it belonged to her. Jonas watched her, unable to hide the gratitude in his eyes. You're here now, he said softly. Yes, Amara whispered, her faint smile enough to tighten something in his chest. I'm here. They walked on, crossing the yard hand in hand. One had once believed she would live her whole life alone. The other had believed he wasn't someone worth choosing. Now they moved toward the warm light ahead, together. And Dust Hollow, for the first time in years, looked like a true home. If you see a part of yourself in Amara and Jonas, the years behind you, the quiet loneliness or the small hope you held on to, feel free to share a few words in the comments. And if you'd like to follow more gentle Wild West love stories like this one, please like, subscribe, and share so this channel can keep bringing more warm tales to your evenings.